What if the Watchers are still here? A speculative restoration reading on Helel ben Shachar, Satan, the two falls, and whether about 200 embodied rebel angels have been roaming the earth under changing identities until the judgment. What if we have been flattening the story too much? What if the scriptures never intended us to treat every fallen being as though they all belong to the exact same rebellion, the exact same category, and the exact same judgment? What if there were two falls? What if the first fall was the premortal fall of Helel ben Shachar, the bright one, the shining one, the one later called Lucifer, who after rebellion became Satan, yea, even the devil, Moses 4:4. And what if the second fall was something else entirely? What if the second fall was the fall of embodied angels, or at least body-capable heavenly beings, who came down to assist, govern, watch, or administer on the earth, but then crossed boundaries they had no right to cross? What if Genesis 6 is not a vague myth? What if Enoch is preserving an older memory than most people want to admit? What if Jude and Peter are not speaking in abstractions, but are echoing a real ancient rebellion distinct from Satan's first revolt? And what if those beings are not gone? That is the question. Not just, did they exist? But, what if they are still here? Let's start with the first fall. Before rebellion, I do not think the adversary should properly be called Satan. I think the language of his former station matters. Isaiah 14:12 gives the phrase behind the traditional title, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" The Hebrew behind that line is commonly understood as Helel ben Shachar, the shining one, the bright one, the son of dawn. That sounds less like a permanent personal name and more like a title of rank, brightness, and office. And then what happens? Moses 4:4 does not leave the transition blurry. It says, "And he became Satan, yea, even the devil, the father of all lies." He became Satan. So why keep calling him by the title of the office he lost? Why speak as though he still properly carries the brightness of a station he forfeited? Would it not be more precise to say that before the fall he stood in the station described by Helel ben Shachar, but after the fall he should properly be called Satan, because that is what he became? That is the first fall. And what kind of beings fell with him? Spirits. Doctrine and Covenants 29:36-37 says, "The devil rebelled against me, and a third part of the hosts of heaven turned he away from me because of their agency." That happened before Adam's mortal probation. That happened before Eden as we know it. That happened before mortal embodiment in the ordinary order. So the first fall is the fall of unembodied rebel spirits. That category matters, because it is not the same as the second. Now comes the real question. What if there was another fall later? What if not every heavenly rebellion belongs to that first premortal revolt? What if Genesis 6 is opening the door to something else? The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Genesis 6:2. That is not the language of disembodied devils being denied bodies. That is not the language of the first rebellion. That sounds like a different kind of transgression. Then Genesis 6:4 adds, "There were giants in the earth in those days." Why say that at all if nothing extraordinary happened? Why does the text preserve the memory of mixture, transgression, and giants if the whole thing is supposed to be reduced to ordinary human intermarriage? Then Enoch comes in and says what many people do not want to hear. 1 Enoch 6:6 says, "And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared." 200. Not a vague symbolic fog. Not a handful. Not a metaphor. 200. And what did they do? 1 Enoch 7 says, "And they took unto themselves wives." and began to go in unto them and to defile themselves with them. First Enoch says they taught forbidden things, warfare, enchantments, corrupt arts, adornments, hidden knowledge. So what are we looking at? Not merely temptation from outside, not merely devils whispering, but heavenly beings crossing boundaries inside the earthly sphere. That sounds like a second fall. And what does the New Testament do with that? Does it ignore it? No. Jude 6 says, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." 2 Peter 2:4 says, "God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment." So Jude and Peter both preserve the memory of angels that sinned in a distinct way, and were judged in a distinct way. That sounds less like Satan's first rebellion, and more like Enoch's watchers. So why do so many people insist on collapsing them into one category? Why not let the text say more than one thing? Why not admit the possibility of two falls? Now bring in the pearl of great price. Abraham 3:22-23 says, "Among all these there were many of the noble and great ones. And God saw these souls that they were good." That opens another door. There were degrees, ranks, orders, distinctions. Not an undifferentiated mass. There were noble and great ones. Then Doctrine and Covenants 88:15 says, "The spirit and the body are the soul of man." Now put that together and ask the question nobody wants to ask. What if not all higher orders remain faithful? What if some among the higher heavenly orders, beings with rank, beings with commission, beings with assignment, later became the watchers? Not all of them. Not the whole class. But some of them. Would that really be strange? Does not Scripture repeatedly show that higher privilege means greater accountability? Is not the ruin of the exalted one of the oldest patterns in all sacred history? So what if the watchers were not low beings acting badly, but higher beings falling hard? What if they came to the earth in a legitimate role, watching, helping, governing, teaching, administering, and then transgressed through unlawful union, unlawful mixture, and unlawful revelation? Would that not explain why their judgment is so severe? Would that not explain why Jude speaks of angels leaving their own habitation? Would that not explain why they are treated not merely as sinners, but as prisoners? Then comes the most interesting part. What was their sentence? 1 Enoch 10 says they were bound beneath the earth for 70 generations. 70 generations. Now yes, many people want to make that symbolic, and maybe there is symbolic force in it. But what if it is also chronological? What if a generation here is reckoned at 40 years? Then 70 generations becomes 2,800 years. So ask the obvious question. What if the first phase of their punishment was literal imprisonment in the earth for 2,800 years? Buried. Shut up. Restricted. Entombed. Waiting. That already fits Enoch, Jude, and Peter very well. But here's where it gets fun. What if that was not the end of the sentence? What if it was only the first stage? What if the sentence changed form without ending? What if after 70 generations beneath the earth, they were not released into heaven, not redeemed, not vindicated, not destroyed, but instead transferred into a second phase of punishment? What if they remain confined to the earth? Not in it now, but still on it. Not buried, but not free. Not restored, but roaming. Not blessed, but sentenced. Would that not make the earth itself their prison house? Would that not make sense of the difference between being bound under the earth and then still being reserved unto judgment? Would it not explain how a being can move and still not be free? A prisoner moved from a dungeon to a walled territory is still a prisoner. So what if that is what happened? What if the Watchers moved from subterranean confinement to earthbound immortality under judgment? Not exaltation. Not resurrection glory. Not righteous translation. But punitive continuance. Still here. Still sentenced. Still unable to leave. And if that is true, then what follows? Well, what do you think follows? If about 200 such beings have remained on the earth for many centuries, what exactly would that look like? Would they keep one public identity forever? Of course not. Would human societies fail to notice a person living the same life for 500 years? Obviously not. So what would they do? Would they not create characters for themselves? Would they not assume one role, one name, one life story for a season? And when that character becomes too old, too visible, too exposed, too stale, would they not stage a death, disappear, and return later as someone else? Why wouldn't they? If they cannot die, then they have to manage appearances. If they are confined to the earth, then they have to adapt. If they are patient, ancient, and intelligent, then they would become masters of reinvention. So what if the same condemned beings have been known as many different people over the last 1600 years and more? What if they have worn one mask after another? What if some personalities in history were never quite what they seemed? What if some of the most unusual, disruptive, dazzling, manipulative, boundary-breaking figures were not merely brilliant mortals at all? Would that be so impossible in a world where Scripture already says beings can be encountered unawares? Hebrews 13:2 says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Most people read that in the safest, sweetest, most harmless way possible. But why narrow it so quickly? The verse proves at least one thing: people can meet beings they do not recognize for what they are. So why must the unseen world be reduced to almost nothing? Why should we assume the earth is spiritually thin when Scripture presents it as spiritually crowded? And Restoration Scripture only makes that easier to think about. Doctrine and Covenants 7 says John would tarry until I come in my glory. 3 Nephi 28 says the 3 Nephites were given power over death and remain on the earth ministering among men. That means Scripture already gives us a category for embodied persons who remain on the earth through long ages. John and the 3 Nephites remain by divine commission. So why is it so hard to imagine that another class of beings remains by divine sentence? One is holy continuance. The other would be condemned continuance. One stays because heaven authorized it in mercy. The other stays because heaven imposed it in judgment. But in both cases, the earth remains populated by beings whose presence extends far beyond the ordinary human span. So maybe the real question is not whether such a thing is possible. Maybe the real question is why we have been taught to treat it as impossible. Why should the scriptural world be reduced to only modern comfort level categories? Why should ancient Jewish literature, Jude, Peter, Genesis, Abraham, Moses, John, and the 3 Nephites all be flattened so that nothing strange remains? Maybe the strange parts are there on purpose. Maybe the world is stranger than we were told. Maybe the earth is not only a place of probation for man. Maybe it is also a prison for condemned powers. Maybe some beings on this earth are here because they cannot leave. Maybe some of them look like ordinary men and women. Maybe some of them have lived under many names. Maybe some of them have staged many deaths. Maybe the same 200 rebels have been recycling characters for centuries. Maybe history has been sharing space with prisoners older than empires. And if that sounds wild, then maybe it is supposed to. Because Scripture is wild. Enoch is wild. Genesis 6 is wild. Jude is wild. Peter is wild. The pearl of great price opens categories most people barely know what to do with. So maybe the safe, flattened reading is not the serious reading after all. Maybe the serious reading is the one willing to ask harder questions. What if Helel ben Shachar belongs to the first fall, and Satan is what he became after losing that station? What if the first fall was the fall of unembodied rebel spirits before Eden? What if the second fall was the fall of embodied watchers who came later, sinned on the earth, and were judged differently? What if their first imprisonment was under the earth for 70 generations? What if their second imprisonment has been on the earth until judgment? What if they cannot die? What if that is why they must keep changing names, roles, and masks? What if they are still here? And if they are still here, how many times have men met them and never known it? How many times has history called them by a borrowed name? How many times has one of their deaths not been a death at all? How many times has a condemned being simply stepped off one stage and re-entered through another door? I think these are the right questions. And I think the answers may be much closer to belief than most people are willing to admit. Plain text footnotes 1. Isaiah 14:12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Hebrew commonly understood as Helel ben Shachar, shining one, son of dawn. 2. Moses 4:4. And he became Satan, yea, even the devil, the father of all lies. 3. Doctrine and Covenants 29:36-37. The devil rebelled against me, and a third part of the hosts of heaven turned he away from me because of their agency. 4. Genesis 6:2-4. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives. There were giants in the earth in those days. 5. 1 Enoch 6:6. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared. 6. 1 Enoch 7. And they took unto themselves wives, and began to go in unto them and to defile themselves with them. 7. 1 Enoch 8. The watchers taught unlawful arts, enchantments, warfare, adornments, and corrupt knowledge. 8. 1 Enoch 10. The watchers were bound beneath the earth for 70 generations, until judgment. 9. Jude 6. The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. 10. 2 Peter 2:4. God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. 11. Abraham 3:22-23. Among all these there were many of the noble and great ones, and God saw these souls that they were good. 12. Doctrine and Covenants 88:15. The spirit and the body are the soul of man. 13. Hebrews 13:2. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. 14. Doctrine and Covenants 7. John would tarry until I come in my glory. 15. 3 Nephi 28. The 3 Nephites were given power over death, and remain on the earth ministering among men.